This is episode 79 of AA Beyond Belief, the podcast, and I'm your host, John S. Today I'll be speaking with Alex M., author of Daily Reprieve, AA for Atheists and Agnostics, a new meditation book using quotes from the Big Book, followed by Alex's comments. Hello, I am with Alex M., author of Daily Reprieve, AA for Atheists and Agnostics. Alex, how you doing today?
Very well, John. Thank you for having the interview and speaking with me.
Well, I look forward to it. It's I love the book, by the way. I think I'm going to use it at our meeting today. I think I might have talked to you last time that we talked. I told you that I was a little bit concerned about my group, that a lot of our meetings are tending to be someone coming up with a topic. And I always like to have a meeting that's centered on something that's read, because it kind of gives you some grounding. And what you've put together here, just as way of introduction, the book is called Daily Reprieve, AA for Atheists and Agnostics. And it's really a remarkable book because what it is, it's a daily reflections book, like what you see in a lot of AA meetings, but done from a secular perspective. And what Alex has done is he's taken a little paragraph from every chapter of the Big Book, and then he just quotes that chapter. And then he writes his consideration of the chapter, his take on it. And it's just really a neat way to, introduce someone to the Big Book, to, I think, stimulate conversation in a AA meeting that centers on recovery. You learn a lot about the history of AA, how the steps came to be. I mean, it's just incredible. And then in addition to the daily reflections, there is also a collection of essays that Alex had written that are very, very well done. So really good stuff here. So thank you for putting that together, Alex.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you.
Maybe a good thing to do to start off is, would you like to tell us a little bit about your background? What got you into AA, what your experience has been in AA, your relationship with the Big Book, and what got you interested in putting this book together?
Sure. I came into AA about 11 years ago, and I'm from a Midwestern town. And I've been familiar with AA for a number of years because my father was an alcoholic, and a long time ago, before my drinking got out of control, I used to go to AA meetings with him. And unfortunately, it didn't take with him, but I did sort of get exposed to the process of a meeting and what it was about. And after he died from his illness, I kind of forgot about it. And I found through the years that, when I was a very young child, like so many of us I hear in AA, I just felt like I didn't fit in with the folks around me. And I really wanted to have some type of connection, with my peers and, the folks in school and all that sort of thing, and just didn't know how to do it. So when I couldn't do that, I wanted relief because it upset me. I mean, it's like, what's wrong with me, and no one cares about me, and the kids at school make fun of me and all this sort of thing, and so I looked for an escape. And this is when I was very young. I'm talking about 6 or 7 years old. And my escape at the time was through reading. And I loved to read. And I was an only child, so I didn't have to deal with brothers and sisters and all that sort of thing. So I would go up into my room and just read books, and I would escape that way. And that helped, but it didn't really work that well for me. But it gave me a bit of relief. And as I got older, into teenagehood, if you will, I really felt like an outcast. I was smart, but I wasn't the smartest kid at school, and I wasn't good at sports and couldn't socialize with the ladies very well, and all of that stress said to me, again, you're a failure, and what's wrong with you, and And I looked for escape again. You know, I didn't like the feelings, the emotions that I was having. And I found alcohol. And alcohol worked for me for about 40 years. I found that when I drank, all of a sudden the promises would come true. Suddenly I would fit in. I would be accepted into the group. The group would approve me. And I felt better. You know, it was just, I didn't have to go through a lot of experimentation with other addictions because the alcohol worked. And over time, as many of us have experienced, the alcohol stopped working. And I don't remember the date that it stopped working for me, but it probably was around 1996, in that area. And all of a sudden I found that I could drink a tremendous amount of alcohol and I could be drunk, but I would still be conscious and the committee in my head would still be going, and I wasn't getting relief. And it was at that point I knew I had already kind of jumped off that cliff. You know, there was no going back. They talk about the cucumber pickle kind of thing, and it was it was very upsetting because I thought, I'm in trouble now, you know, and we all, or many of us, go through that transition from being that hard drinker that Bill Wilson talks about to the real alcoholic. And but you know, being a good alcoholic, I thought I could fix this myself, and you know, self-reliance and self-sufficiency would work. I'm a smart guy, and you know, I figured I'd figure out a way, and I went through all the stuff that Bill's story talks about, except the institutional part. I was never institutionalized, and fortunately, I was never jailed either, so my consequences were not extreme to motivate me, but in my mind, I could fix myself, and obviously that didn't work, and I tried that for about another 10 years, but it stopped. You know, I couldn't do it alone, and that was the light bulb that came off in my head, and it was sort of prompted, if you will, by just that hopelessness. You know, I tried and tried and tried, and the only options I had, I thought, were basically suicide, or, you know, again, I kind of knew about AA. I thought, well, maybe this AA thing, you know, or should I kill myself? Well, you know, that debate, you know, they talk about that in the book too, you know, you know, what should we do, you know, and I had to think about it. And fortunately, I was helped into AA literally, because I wasn't sober at the time, to my first AA meeting. And when I got there, I did feel a hope in the ruins, and that, I think, was a real blessing for me, because I know people who come in AA and said they really didn't connect initially with AA, but I felt like these are just, you know, guys I've drank with in a bar for years, except they're not drinking, and I could connect with those guys in the bar, so I can surely connect with them in the rooms of AA, and I did, and I'd ask them, you know, how don't I drink on the way home today? And they talked about their experience and the one day at a time and asking God for help and just keep me sober for the next minute or hour, or you know, the daily reprieve that we have, the 24-hour approach. And I never believed in I was never a religious person or connected with God or believed in that, but I believed in them. You know, I figured, well, you know, that's what they did. You know, I'll just say, help me stay sober for the next 10 minutes or 1 hour. And somehow I did stay sober, but when I talked to other folks new in the program, I also emphasized that I did more than that.
Right.
You know, I didn't I didn't answer the phone for my old buddies. I didn't go to the bar. I didn't go to the liquor store. I started reading the big book when my mind cleared, and I went to a lot of meetings. I hung out at the local AA clubs. So I think all those things helped me stay sober long enough to hear the message of recovery in the big book. And I was talking to I was at a meeting, what's today? A couple of days ago. Actually, it's our only AA agnostic meeting in town, which is really a standard AA meeting. But one of the members, newcomers, early in AA, was sort of talking about how, since they're not drinking, they have so much time on their hands and they don't know what to do with it.
Yeah, I remember noticing that.
And I thought, oh, I can relate to that. And we talked about how, each of us filled that time void with other activities. And for me, obviously, I figured out, well, maybe I better immerse myself in AA so I don't get in trouble and, start drinking again. But also, I remember when I live in an old house. It's an old farmhouse built in the 1840s, and it's wood and it's got brick walls and all that. But when I moved in, I actually moved in because my wife had passed away in 1996, and so I couldn't stay in the same house, so I moved to another house. And when I moved in, for some reason, one of the prior tenants or occupants had painted the dining room floor blue. I mean, it was kind of weird, but they had painted the floor blue. So when I had all that time on my hands, I thought, well, I'm going to take the blue paint off the floor because, it's good you had old hardwood floors underneath. And so I thought I can do this the easy way, with mechanics, or I can do it the hard way. And for me, the hard way was taking a pocket knife and literally scraping the paint off that hardwood floor because I figured that'll take me forever, but it will give me something to do, not to think about drinking. And that's what I did. That's how I filled my time a lot, whether it was the middle of the night or during the day. But I had to stay occupied. Yeah. If I didn't, I knew what would happen. So, once I got to AA, I was a believer. I believed in the big book and what the people told me about how they got sober. So I followed directions. Yeah. And it worked. So,
it sounds a lot like my experience. I mean, when I came in, I had no real religious beliefs. I didn't have any experience with religion. But I did just kind of say, well, this is what these guys are doing. I'm going to do it. There must be some psychological benefit to these things that they're doing. Right. And like you, I don't know how long it took me, but there was a period of time where I was just going to meetings. I mean, I went to a lot of meetings, but then there was a time where I guess the fog lifted enough to where I could actually start reading the book and going through the steps through the book, which is what my group did at the time. So I have a real similar experience. Later for me, I realized that I was an atheist, and then I started reinterpreting the program. Did you go through any kind of a process like that?
Oh, absolutely. I came in May, and I was very faithful to the meetings and, tried to do the coffee thing and talk to people. A little shy in the beginning. Yeah. But I didn't want to get in the step work, and they all told me, they said, well, we got sober doing the steps, and, that will lead you to that new design for living. And I still thought I was self-reliant. I still thought, well, maybe I can skip that part. Don't have to fool with it. It looks like a lot of work. But after about 6 months sober, I was suicidal again because it's like, this life is horrible, I didn't get any relief from stopping drinking. Yeah. And that's what I'd hoped I would get immediately when I came into AA. So I found a sponsor, and he was a born again Christian, just a wonderful, wonderful fellow. And we went through the steps together. And of course, starting the second step starts talking about God. And we had long discussions about God because for me, and I didn't have any, and don't today, any, prejudice against religion or anything, but I just couldn't connect with it. You know, I mean, I was an acolyte in church when I grew up, and I loved all that, but I never connected with that higher power being God in my early years and certainly in my later years. So he would tell me, he said that because I wasn't self-sufficient, I had to, I had to find something spiritual, and it didn't have to be his God or God of other people in AAs, but I had to have something where I could say, I'm not God. I need something spiritual, whatever that is in my life. In other words, non-human, to help me get me through not only living to help me live in sobriety. And that kind of made sense to me. But the book, when I read the book, it was all jumbled up. I mean, it was, my interpretation of the book, of Bill's writing, was that it was like the parachute story. You come into AA and they talk about doing the steps and all that, and they say, well, you can jump out of the plane with the parachute or, not with one, but we suggest you use a parachute. In the big book, it says, well, you can pick your higher power, but we really suggest it needs to be God. And so it's kind of like, okay. He really helped me, my sponsor really helped me say, it does not have to be God. It just has to be something that you can connect with, that's spiritual, that's not human, that will help you get sober. And that could be a higher force or purpose in life. Or for me today, it's a set of higher principles that are fairly well outlined in the steps, but something that'll help you live a better life. And that kind of made sense to me. It's the connection part. Because when he suggested, he said, just get a piece of paper and write down what you can believe in that's something spiritual, and that's your higher power. And if you can connect with that, on a daily basis, doing that morning meditation or the evening review, throughout the day stuff they talk about in step 10, then use it. Because it's there to be used to help you be a better person. And it was amazing because he was, he actually was a very religious fellow, but he opened the door for me to a spirituality that I could relate to, that would help me, regardless of the kind of the way God is talked about in the big book. And I had a resentment against that for a long time because, it's like, well, the book's saying I got to believe in God, which, kind of technically it's not, but kind of, subtext it is.
Yeah.
And
I
had to, it's a contradiction, but I had to get over that resentment. And when I talk to people today, I find it's the resentment against the text in the book that kind of gets people tangled up sometimes.
Yeah, I agree.
And I get it. I get it. I get kind of pissed off too sometimes, and we agnostics chapter and all that kind of stuff. But that's their story.
Right.
That is how they got sober, and that doesn't mean I have to follow exactly their footsteps.
Yes. That's how I see it,
and that
too.
helped me a lot.
Yeah, same here. I'm very much like you. I went to a group that was very heavy into studying the big book. I mean, it was something where, like, for example, my sponsor would say, John, I want you to read this chapter every day for 30 days. Call me, and then we'll meet and go over it. And then we would meet, and at length we'd go over sentence by sentence, and we'd stop and discuss and talk and all this kind of stuff. And then we would, everything that we would do would lead up to the next step and everything like that. So I went through this long process of going through the steps, and we didn't rush through it. We really took our time to study it. But I think at the time that I was doing that, I was just very willing just to do, whatever was suggested to do. And I really tried to follow things the way it was laid out in the book. But then fast forward many, many, many years later, when I come to realize I'm an atheist and I start looking at the book a little bit differently, and I did begin to develop some resentments against it. But I finally came to the conclusion that you did, that this is an historical document. This is the experience of those people who founded this program. And I don't have to have the same experience, but I can draw from their experience, and I can put it in context of where they were coming from in their lives and in their time. And that's how I see it now. And that's what I like about your book, by the way, is you really, I like that you leave the book intact. and then you actually go through and you share about, every little thing in that book based upon your own perspective. And it really, I think, helps people, especially if they don't have a lot of background in AA, to understand how this stuff can apply to someone who might not have a God for a higher power. Mm-hmm. So, what led you to write the book? Can you talk a little bit about that and the process of writing it? It must have taken you a good long time, I imagine.
It took about 2.5 years to get the book done. And, it was interesting because just throughout AA, we all talk about higher power and God just in general, but right. I was talking with my sister-in-law's wife one day, and this was about 6 months or so before I thought about writing the book. And she was not an alcoholic, but her I can't remember. I don't know, mother or grandmother was or whatever. But, and she asked me, she said, I only have one question about AA. Is it religious? Mm. And she actually, had been to an AA meeting at some point. And this question comes up kind of all the time, but for some reason, I actually started thinking about this and trying to explain to her that, well, it's really not a religious program, it's a spiritual program, and, what's that mean and all this. But that discussion led me really to thinking about all the folks that I had met through the years prior who had come into AA with I don't want to say a God problem, but didn't believe in God, were atheist or agnostic. And those folks, in my experience, many of them, and it's kind of been documented a little bit in some short studies, but, most of them don't come back. Mm. And maybe they get sober some other way, but I'm thinking, oh my God, these people, they don't stay in AA, and maybe they die or something. And I got to thinking about that whole situation, and for some reason I thought, well, the book is the instruction manual. Maybe and I loved reading. I read the meditation books in the morning, 24 hours a day, mm-hmm. God stuff aside. Mm-hmm. I love the format of it, and I thought, well, maybe we can incorporate, or I can incorporate the big book and then do it in sort of a similar format to have a big book section, big book selection or excerpt, mm-hmm. and then a thought, kind of a thought, and then a question, mm-hmm. An action item mm-hmm. For the people to reflect on. Mm-hmm. So I started doing that, and it obviously took a while. But it flowed fairly easily, but it took a lot of time. Mm-hmm. And then I added the stuff in the back, the musings in the back, because mm-hmm. I just felt like it basically. Mm-hmm. So over that period of time, and fortunately today, in this day and age, we can self-publish, and there's mm-hmm. a mechanism to do that. I didn't need an agent and all mm-hmm. that. So, the book was sort of created out of my belief that, if you don't believe in God, AA can still work for you. Right. You know what I'm saying? Right. And don't dismiss it. Don't run away from AA. Give it a fair chance. Don't go out there and die because, the book's full of, God stuff. Yeah. Because it can work for us. For non-believers or free thinkers, mm-hmm. and especially the younger folks. I mean, I'm 64, and I find a lot of the younger folks, I don't know if this is actually true, but, they may be more spiritually oriented than religiously oriented mm-hmm. when they come in mm-hmm. Than the older folks who are in AA, and I just hate seeing anybody, again, especially the younger folks, just run away from AA because of the God, and they don't come back. Right. That's the thing. A lot of them don't come back. It's like, oh, they'll be back later. It's like, no, not necessarily. Right. So how can we open that door wider as an AA member, as trying to carry the message? How can I effectively carry the message of AA, the message of recovery from that hopeless state of mind and body as an atheist in AA? Mm-hmm. How can mm-hmm. I best carry that message? And mm-hmm. that's kind of the end of the line motivation for me today. Yep. So it's just opening the door a little wider for everybody.
Yeah, I know. What's interesting is the book would actually be useful to anyone, even if someone believed in God, they would be perfectly comfortable with the book, I think.
I think so too, and it's interesting. My sister-in-law is actually a graphics designer, and she lives up in Maine. And for the cover, I was up visiting her and her wife, who'd asked me that question about religion. And so we sat down, and she's doing her thing on her Macintosh, and it's like, well, what do you want to name this book? And so, I said Daily Reprieve, which actually was suggested by another person in AA, because I didn't know what to call the book. And she goes, well, it needs a subtitle. What do you want to call it? And so I can't remember, but I had some subtitle picked out, and she goes, "Oh, no, you just can't do that." It was something like Daily Reprieve, meditations for people in AA. And she goes, "No, that's not what that book's about." And I said, "Well, it is for atheists and agnostics, but it's kind of for everybody too. I don't want to exclude people if they're not atheists or agnostics, because it's the big book. It's got the whole. She goes, no. You have to say exactly what that book's about."
For her.
And so, she picked out the subtitle. She goes, "This is for atheists and agnostics."
Good
and I
for
said,
her.
"Well, then people might think that if they're not atheists or agnostics, they shouldn't read the book." And she goes, "Tell the truth. That's what the book's about."
Good for her.
Know your audience. And so we got in this big fight about what to name. Well, not a fight, but we had this heated discussion for like an hour on what the subtitle ought to be. And I thought, well, you're smarter than I am, so we'll just call it AA for Atheists and Agnostics, which is what it is. But
that was smart, because otherwise, it's a great book and anyone could use it, but there's not a lot of material for people out there who want to understand this program from a secular way. And I tell you, there's a big demand for it. The podcasts that we do on the 12 steps are the most popular podcasts that we ever do at AA Beyond Belief, because people are really interested in, as non-believers, how do I do this? Especially if they're new and they don't have that experience. So this is great to have this. I thought I would read one of the readings, and I thought I'd just pick today's reading because I was actually looking at it for our meeting today. I'm going to read this for our meeting today. And today is January the 6th, isn't it? Yeah, January 6th. Okay, so this is from January 6th, from the foreword to the second edition. Another reason for the wide acceptance of AA was the ministration of friends in medicine, religion, and the press, together with innumerable others who became our able and persistent advocates. Without such support, AA could have made only the slowest progress. Alcoholics Anonymous is not a religious organization. Neither does AA take any particular medical point of view, though we cooperate widely with the men of medicine as well as with the men of religion. And that's a foreword to the second edition, page XX. And then the consideration, which is the part that Alex writes. Once we come to believe that we have a chance of recovery, we admit we need help. By ourselves, we are never able to stop drinking and get our life on track, despite trying for years to be self-reliant. Joining AA and reading the Big Book is a start, but we may also need support from our friends in other fields outside of AA. Having a trusted AA sponsor and guide who can show us how they got sober and found a new way of living is also essential. And then the question, am I willing to consult with other professionals if needed, and find an AA sponsor for help and guidance during my journey into recovery? What a marvelous way to provoke a discussion, in my opinion. And what a lot of amazing stuff is in there when you think about it. You're talking about, traditions. You're talking about the admission of defeat in step 1. You're talking about getting outside help. Making use of psychiatrists, psychologists, doctors, whoever, and even people of religion if they can be helpful. So, I think it'll make for a good meeting, actually, to read from that. So,
well, thank you.
This is the kind of stuff that I believe that is real helpful for for AA meetings, and especially for agnostic meetings like ours, because I tell you, we get a lot of newcomers at our group, We Agnostics in Kansas City. We get a lot of those people that you're talking about. I consider them young. They're in their 20s or 30s, and they're not quite comfortable with the language of Alcoholics Anonymous, the old 1930s prose. They're not particularly religious, and many of them wouldn't even give AA a chance if it weren't for a secular program. Now, it's great that they have this option where they can come to a secular AA meeting and they can meet like-minded folks and they can make friends who support them in their recovery, and they do well. We also have step meetings where we'll talk about steps from reading other books and so forth. But we don't read the big book, and they're missing on a very important piece. And that's the understanding the history, the culture of Alcoholics Anonymous, and the origin of this entire thing, and the steps and the fellowship. I think it's important, and I've always loved history, but I think it's important to understand where we came from and to build on the work of the past and to somehow incorporate it into our lives in a way that makes sense to us. So this book gives a way to introduce the big book to a lot of people who might otherwise just ignore it, you know?
Yeah, that was sort of another ulterior motive.
Yeah.
It's like, well, if you get nothing else out of it and you actually look at it a little bit, at least you'll get exposed to the big book, which is, again, I think I'm a AA historian, and what helped me was over time, the more I learned about the history of AA, the more closely I felt connected to the program itself, and that helps keep me sober. But the big when I have a sponsee, I mean we go through the big book. I mean the first 164.
Right.
I mean we sit down and we have as you had said earlier, John, I kind of give them a little assignment,
right.
and then we talk about it and highlight certain things that may be important to them, and just have a discussion about it. But you're right. A lot of folks I've noticed shy away from the actual book itself. Mm-hmm. It's just, well, you do these 12 steps, and that's all we talk about, and but the whole meat of the book, it explains how to relate to the world, or how those guys did at least, and how they got out, and then how they found hope. Yeah, really, how they found hope. And
I think part of it too is it is sort of a generational thing, because I'm 55, so I think about it. When I was learning how to read, I was reading material that was probably written in the 1950s, 1960s, 1950s.
Right.
So that prose and that language wasn't that far removed from the way that the big book was written. So when I got the big book, and I kind of remember this 1988, looking at the big book, I thought, what? It's pretty old, but still I was able to understand and digest it, and I was okay with it. Whereas someone now in their 30s who, did not grow up with that kind of language or whatever, it's a little bit more difficult for them to even understand it. But if they approach it from a more historical perspective and understand where the people came from, I think that's even more important now than it ever was before, because we're talking about something now that was, more than 80 years ago when it was written. Right. So you really do want to kind of understand the time, the place, the people who wrote it, to really get the full measure out of it, in my opinion. I got to tell you too, the whole thing about AA history, I've come to appreciate it more and more. If you haven't read this book, I would highly recommend it. I did a podcast with this guy not long ago. It's called Drunks: An American History.
Okay.
It's really good, but I read that book, and he talks about the history of Alcoholics Anonymous, but he also talks about, and it's Christopher Finan who wrote it, but he also talks about just the history of the treatment of alcoholism from really the beginning of the United States up until present time. And when you read that, you really appreciate what Alcoholics Anonymous has contributed to the treatment for alcoholism. I mean, AA wasn't exactly new, but there was something about it that, and maybe it was the time it came on the scene, maybe it was Bill Wilson, I don't know, but maybe a combination of all these things. But it really changed the way that we approach treatment and our understanding of alcoholism. And AA was very free in sharing their program with any who wanted it. And there was like this huge revolution of people with all kinds of problems who would adapt the steps for their own particular needs. And then even the people who didn't like AA would sprung off from it and started their own things, So it's like all this stuff came from AA, and when you really and not even that too, all the like the National Council on Alcoholism that was started by Marty Mann, and all these other things that sprung from AA members whose work wasn't necessarily part of AA when they were doing it. But anyway, you read that, and I know that, pride isn't something that we like to, we try to avoid, I guess. But I felt a certain amount of pride in AA after reading that book and understanding the history a little bit better, and just how unique our fellowship is, that it's lasted as long as it has. Most of these things didn't last very long.
Well, I think, I know this isn't a history lesson, but I think Bill Wilson's appreciation and research into like the Washingtonians and some of the other groups, and that he spent a lot of time looking at why other groups failed, and chose not to repeat those mistakes. And what I find in AA is the focus of the primary purpose of carrying the message, being the emphasis, and not having a lot of, I guess, rules and regulations, as you had mentioned, John, really contributed to, we're still here now after 80 years, and the traditions helped, I think, in the 50s, early 50s, when he came out with that, so our groups don't, kill each other and all that sort of thing. But I think Bill had a lot of respect for the history of treatment. I don't want to say how alcoholism had been treated in the past, and tried not to set up a system that would fail based on his experience with other organizations. It's a fascinating history. You're right. It's a fascinating history, but the primary purpose and the service component of that my job is to carry the message to another alcoholic who still suffers. And that's why I'm here today. And how can I best do that? And if I stick to that and don't get distracted by all the other stuff going on in the world around me, then, I'll probably, we'll succeed. We'll stay put, if you will, as an organization. But I agree, it's a fascinating history, and how, and it was a revolution. It was a revolutionary way of how alcoholism was treated compared to the prior methods, institutionalization and all that sort of thing. So yeah, I have a lot of respect, and I am proud of AA, not in a prideful, not in a, arrogant, prideful manner, but it's just it's saved so many lives through the years. Millions of people, I'm sure it's in the millions whose lives have been saved, and their families, the families. I didn't realize when I came into AA, it's not just, the father who's drunk, the kids suffer and the wife suffered, but I learned in talking with some of my mom's a long time Al-Anon lady, and I was talking to some of her friends, because I go to Al-Anon too, and her friends, we were just talking, and her friends said, when you were out drinking, obviously it hurt your mother so much, but it hurt us so much because we were your mother's friends, and when she hurt, we hurt. So it's kind of that ripple effect of the, of the, I guess, destructiveness of the alcoholic in the family. It's not just the family, it's the, the friends of the family. It just reaches out farther and farther. So that was a real eye-opener for me, because I had no clue that other people suffered other than just, the family I pushed away when I was drinking. So it was an eye-opener for me, that aspect of it. But today we can hopefully reverse a lot of that damage, at least if we can get sober and stay sober. So
yeah, absolutely. Well, I enjoyed the conversation. I really enjoyed the book. I'm going to introduce it to my group today, and we'll see how that goes. I think that they'll like it. Yeah. And we have it posted there on AA Beyond Belief, and we'll be posting it with the podcast so people know where they can get it.
Okay.
So really, really a great service that you've done by writing this book. Thank you very much for doing that and for agreeing to come on and talk about it and to share your story with us.
Well, thank you, John. And just remember, it's a group effort. I always tell people it's all a group effort. It's not one of us alone. I mean, seriously, it's us. It's a we in that first word and the first step. It's we.
You're right.
So thank you.
Well, if you're ever in KC, please look me up. I'd be glad to.
I will, and vice versa. Okay. Come, you know where I am, and let me know if you're ever up this way.
Will do. All right, you take care now.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, John. Okay.
Well, that's it for another episode of AA Beyond Belief, the podcast. Thank you for listening, everybody. I hope you enjoyed the program. Hey, if you'd like to help out the podcast, please visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/AA Beyond Belief. We're looking at raising a little bit of money so that we can afford transcripts with our podcast and maybe even help me with some of the editing costs. That would be much appreciated. For a little as $1 a month, you could help out a great deal. If you can't do it, that's fine too. We're just happy to have you here listening. So with that, we'll be back again real soon.